Thank you very much. Thank you, Adam, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We already heard from Enrique that there is a very strong visual component to the presentations today. And of course, also Fiona is going to talk about a different kind of drawing than the one that Enrique was talking about. And I thought that I would like to ensure some consistency here among our different perspectives on commercial law, also to refer to some forms of images, which, just like Enrique did, are also kind of abstract. In particular, I want to focus this presentation on a mental image that we might have. So the image of the market player, it could be a commercial party or it could be a consumer. What kind of person do we imagine that this indeed this market player is? Because depending on the way in which we conceptualize, we visualize this person, actually there might be different consequences in terms of law, in terms of consumer protection. I'm going to focus quite a lot on consumer protection here. But indeed, just to reaffirm the visual component here of these presentations, I intended to include some pictures in these slides. So those are not really slides, so please don't expect to find anything very structured or to follow the argument. It's just to show you something. And at some point, just to ensure consistency with what Enrique was discussing, drawings, you might even see some drawings that I did myself. So, which I actually created after seeing the slides that Enrique prepared. And I thought, I want to do that. But yeah, perhaps I was not successful. Anyway, we were going to start with a picture there, which is at the same time also a recent event, a news. Okay, so this is a news which came out some time ago, not a lot of time. Yeah, this is an article from The Guardian, which is just from the end of May of this year, which is a good news sometimes. Okay? Sometimes we still get good news from the world of commerce. In particular, the news here is that there is a major chocolate manufacturer that decided to go green and to implement some more environmental friendly policies and decided to substitute the traditional plastic wrapper through which the chocolate was packaged and sold through paper wrappers, which of course are much more environmental friendly. And you can see them here. Okay? So it's the traditional chocolate bar that we all know, plus there is this nice area here, this band, a green one, which reinforces the green message, which is good. It immediately sticks with our image in our mind, and it tells us which is recyclable, which is great. Okay, and so this is a picture that already tells us a story, and which is actually a story which starts a little bit earlier, and I would like to start from there. But keep in mind this picture because we are going to conclude with this at the end. Now, this is a picture which actually to any consumer lawyer might actually remind another picture. And I don't know how many of you studied consumer law perhaps in the past? No? But to many people, this actually immediately brings us to memory another picture, which is this one. Okay, so again, a chocolate bar by the same chocolate manufacturer. I'm not going to name it for some reason, but it's called like a nearby planet. And it actually tells us, in that case, the message was different. The packaging is very, very similar. There is a different color and a different message. And the message here is that it is 10% bigger bar. Okay, so it basically means that here Mars is, I named it. Well, but I said that they're doing something good now, so it's okay. Mars is actually promising that they are going to sell this bar, which is 10% bigger than it was before, for the same price. Now, imagine, and as I was mentioning, I decided, inspired by the drawings that Enrique was talking about, I decided to draw this as well, because this picture, unfortunately, is not very good. I was not able to find a better one, so I decided to draw this one, which took the best part of my day. So, unfortunately, I did not buy the book that Enrique was referring to. If I had known the way of doing that, I would have. Unfortunately, I had to resort to this. Anyway, so imagine that you are a consumer, okay? The focus of this presentation. You are a buyer. You are craving chocolate. You are craving sugar. and you are in a supermarket, and you see on the shelves this product. It tells you that it's 10% bigger, and you want, as a rational consumer, as someone who wants to obtain the maximum result with the minimum use of resources, of money, you might think that it is a good idea to buy that. Imagine that you have this piece of chocolate and another one, which is not 10% bigger. And so you buy that, and you are happy with your decision. There might be a problem, however. So, can you identify what kind of problem there might be here? Any idea?
Does it say 10% bigger than what?
Yeah. Well, that's true. The assumption is that it is bigger than it was before, which actually is true. Okay? On the basis of the facts of this case, it is actually factually true that it is 10% bigger. So if you're thinking in contractual terms, in the sense that, okay, this might be deceiving, all the rest, partly, but not for that. Actually...
Sorry, but the packaging could be 10% bigger, or the chocolate could be 10%.
The chocolate.
Right.
The chocolate. Let's say, yeah, it's a good point. There is a small differences there, but let's say that it's the chocolate, which is true, which is 10% bigger. Now, actually, most consumers, me included, of course, by seeing this package, might immediately think that, well, I'm getting this part, which is bigger than before. Now, if you consider actually here, this yellow band is much bigger than 10%. So, in a way, this packaging, this is a marketing strategy, it's suggesting to you that you are going to get all this chocolate extra. But this is almost 30% more. In reality, it should be like this, if the yellow part had to represent the real amount of chocolate that you are getting. Okay? What happens? We are in Germany. We are in 1995, so it's an old case, but it's the starting point of a very important legal evolution, so this is why I wanted to start from there. As you can imagine, what happens? Consumer organizations say, this is misleading. Competitors, other manufacturers of chocolate, say, well, you're getting an unfair advantage out of that. And the chocolate manufacturer can imagine what they're saying. They're saying, well, where did I ever say that the yellow band was representing the amount of chocolate that you are getting extra? Okay? And the consumer organization will go like, well, but this was heavily implied in a way. So we have a problem here, legally speaking. The hard law, in this case, application of the German law of unfair competition at the time, is this an unfair commercial practice? At the time, well, still right now actually, this raised a question of EU law. So I'm one of those old people who still speak about EU law in the UK, so sorry if this is not very interesting anymore, but it is still to me. And this is something that actually had a big impact also on the evolution of English law in this regard. So this is why we're talking about it. The question goes in front of the Court of Justice of the EU. Why? Because if we assume that this practice is misleading for the consumer, then we need to prohibit that. But then the chocolate manufacturer has a problem there because this product was part of a general commercial marketing campaign that was created throughout Europe. Okay? And they were saying like, well, we have been selling this in all other European countries without a problem, and now we have to change it because the German consumer authority is not of the same opinion. This is going to be a limitation to our freedom of trade. EU law terms, you know that. What happens in this case? Limitation of EU law, application of a lot of cases, Cassis de Dijon, CEC, and so on and so forth. This limitation must be proportional and justified. Okay? So, if consumer protection is a reason to limit the freedom of trade, it must be justified on some specific grounds. And what are these grounds? The Court of Justice went. Of course, there are several other cases, so I'm simplifying here. Actually, I should perhaps shorten this part, sorry. But basically, the point here that the Court of Justice is making is that, this is unlikely to be an unfair commercial practice, because the average consumer would understand that this is not to mean the amount of chocolate that you are actually buying. Because the average consumer has some characteristic. He is well informed, is reasonably circumspect and observant. It is interesting also in a comparative perspective. The German law was applying a different standard, which was the one of the uncritical consumer, which produced more protective results. So, anyway, to make a long story short, the point here is that in order to understand whether this practice is fair or unfair, we have to have a particular idea of the consumer in mind. And the idea that the Court of Justice is creating here is one of a consumer which is well-informed, which is circumspect, which is rational. Okay? This is not a coincidence in a way, because, of course, this exactly overlaps with the model of the Homo economicus. So the idea of the rational man, the neoclassic economics actually suggests that market players are. Okay? So in neoclassical economics, of course, there are, of course, economists here who might want to intervene and correct me on this. But basically, we have an assumption that market players are self-interested, rational actors that make the best decision based on the information that they have at the time. And this particular model that we have, the Court of Justice made it as the standard of the consumer with relation to these practices. And this is a standard which now I'm referring to in this particular case, but it's a standard which is very common, and we find it also in other areas. By the way, this is also the reason why this practice is still very common. Still these days, you might buy something like this, suggesting that it is 40% less sugar, thinking that, wow, this is sugar, it's white. but in fact, this is even more explicit than it was before. Okay? But anyway, never mind. This concludes the part about the pictures. The interesting aspect here, therefore, is that we have this movement, this idea in the law, as it has developed. When we are thinking about a consumer, we are thinking mostly, there are exceptions, I'm not going to talk about them, but there are important exceptions, as a rational actor, okay, which maximizes utility. In the same way, which, by the way, the law also acknowledges commercial parties to be. We have heard it from Enrique before. There was this judicial quote in which we heard that people of commerce, they don't care about metaphysics, they are very practical, they think about other stuff, they are rational. So this is the model that we have in mind. There is a problem with this model, however. And I think that it's kind of clear, right? So, it's an unrealistic model, of course. It's not how people actually behave. Actually, there is also a practical component there, a practical problem, which is that this standard reduces the amount of consumer protection generally. But let us focus on this theoretical aspect. It's unrealistic. Okay? Who is this rational person that before buying a chocolate bar makes all these strange calculations about the packaging and so on and so forth? Of course, this standard served an economic function, yet to be the proportional justification for a limitation to the freedom of trade. This is the reason why we conceptualize the consumer in those terms, because we see it through the particular economic rationality that we have in that case. Okay? And of course, over time, you might have heard this theory which has developed of the bounded rationality, right? So, which actually suggests that, people do not always act rationally. In some cases, they do act rationally, but on the basis of the limited information that they have. So we have to keep this into account when we develop policies, and we should keep into account that the consumer is not always a very rational person. This is an old theory. It has been around since the 50s, but it does play some role in the law as well. To the point that, just to speak again about things which are current events, actually a couple of months ago, there was a very interesting question which was asked by a national court to the Court of Justice of the EU, again, from an Italian court, which was again about the standard of consumer protection and the image of the consumer that we have, which seemed to suggest in a way that we should officially recognize that the average consumer should not be the rational man anymore, but it should be the bounded rational man now. It's a very interesting reference. In a way, it's a strange question, to be honest. It was asked by an Italian court dealing on a very complicated issue. It had not to do with chocolate bars, but it had to do with a more dramatic issue, perhaps, which is the issue of the PPIs. Okay, so we know in the UK, PPIs have been still are a very, very big issue, but they are not only specifically to the UK. Also in other countries, the same issue arose. And in particular in Italy, among other countries, the question that the court asked was whether bundling those services and presenting as necessarily interlinked to a consumer who did not have the possibility of being fully rational represented an unfair commercial practice. Okay? And if we have to understand whether something is unfair, of course, we have to refer, in light of the Mars case that I was referring to before, whether the average consumer would be misled. But the court asked, but should we really think of that in rational terms or as a person who has bounded rationality? And so they presented this question, which has not been answered yet. We can already speculate on some possible answers that the Court of Justice might give in this regard. But it illustrates very nicely the different ways in which we can understand the consumers and their behaviors and what consequences this might have on the law and on the level of consumer protection. So this is the development so far. Just to simplify it very, very much, we can imagine that indeed there are different ways in which we can understand market actors to simplify the rational or the boundedly rational man. However, we can attempt a further criticism of this. And in particular, there is a tendency, I would say, in the law, in the consumer and commercial law, in a way, to not really seeing necessarily the real issues in a way. And what is part of this problem? If we conceptualize the consumer or any other market players, either as a rational individual or someone who has bounded rationality, in both cases, we are placing emphasis on one single aspect, which is rationality. Okay? So we are basically linking necessarily our conceptualization of a market player to the notion of what is rational, which again is an entirely economic concept here, but it might not be realistic and it might not be appropriate to understand what is going on in the economy overall, because the economy is not only made of individual choices, of course. Individual choices then lead to something more explicit, more in general. And this is a criticism which can be articulated on different levels. Already in the 70s, Amartya Sen in particular was quite clear in this regard. He made a very nice critique by saying that this rational person that we are always talking about, in reality, is not even a rational fool. He is, and I quote, a social moron, because basically the way in which conceptualized is a person that just tries to maximize his own utility. But this disregards a series of values which are more general. And Amartya Sen made a very strong argument by saying that, well, you know, even our choices are influenced by the set of values that we have, which are not necessarily about maximization of a certain utility. And this was already a strong argument in this regard. But we can also expand it and imagine different areas where this might actually lead to reconceptualize the legal approach that we have. I was talking about, I'm going to make a couple of examples because I don't want to get too abstract in this regard. I was referring before to financial services, okay, the PPIs. Now, of course, the law of financial services is a law which has been developed and changed quite a lot very recently after the crisis. But very often on the basis of an assumption that the reason for the crisis is the lack of rationality of the market actors. Okay? And if you think about the way, even in the media, a financial crisis is always represented, you see that there is this very strong element which keeps recurring. There is panic. Okay? There is a bank run. People are acting frantically because because they're stupid, basically. This is the narrative, right? But is it always so? Of course, this is not the only way in which we understand the causes of a financial crisis. Okay? The debate of a financial crisis is split between the rationalist and the bad fundamentals explanation, for instance. But think of an example. Imagine, again, one of the reasons which is generally presented as the 2008 financial crisis. You remember? People not having a lot of morality, selling toxic products and loans to consumers who were stupid, and they concluded those contracts without having the money to pay for their mortgages. And so we say, oh, this is the fault of everybody, the consumer has been irrational, the trader has basically been greedy, so it's irrational behavior. And the corrective measures that we implement intend to increase the level of rationality of the actors by way of improved information, for instance, by way of the new orthodoxy, by way of financial education, and so on and so forth. But perhaps we should not focus too much on the individual action, on the individual rationality. We have to look at the bigger picture, as I was mentioning before, at what is sometimes called the rationality of the system. For instance, if I place the individual action within a context in which loans are securitized, for instance, credit risk is low, the housing market is booming, perhaps it's not irrational for the trader to sell those products. It's the rational decision in light of the rationality of the market. And perhaps the consumer was not being irrational when he concluded the transaction. In a context in which you don't have access to housing, for instance, in a context in which you name all other bad fundamentals that there are, perhaps that's the rational thing to do given the circumstances. Okay? So this is a possible example of the interrelation between the two. How do we conceptualize this thing? What I'm suggesting here is that we should actually not even do what I was doing right now. We should not draw a very strong dichotomy between the action of the individual, the rationality of the individual, and the rationality of the system. Because, of course, in the best tradition of post-Marxist studies, we know that the two things are interrelated. And in fact, we only understand individual rationality in light of the expectations and the principles of the system rationality. Okay? Referring particularly to the work of Godelier in this regard, who is a French anthropologist, who made this point particularly clear. Let us make another example, and then I draw to a conclusion, because I think I mostly made the point. Let us go back to this image to make another example. So the point here is understanding whether someone is acting, market actor is acting rationally or non-rationally, perhaps perfect rationality in light of the neoclassical assumption, or limited rationality in light of behavioralist approaches to economic theory, is always focused on rationality, but individual rationality, but we have to understand it through the prism of system rationality, of the rationality of the market. What are the expectations of the market? What are the values of the market, on the basis of which we judge individual behavior, and then we come to the conclusion that it is more or less rational, and on the basis of that, we give a different legal treatment. Let's take the example of Mars again. This is purely hypothetical, okay, as an example. It's just to make an experiment here. We are all happy about this chocolate manufacturer going green. We see that there is the green band, in this case, and we are all happy about it. However, imagine, hypothetical again, that the paper wrapper is more expensive than the plastic wrapper, okay? Perhaps it's a new technology, difficult to say in reality, but okay, whatever. Imagine it's a new way of doing the form of chocolate wrapper, which is more costly. In the same article that I'm referring to, for instance, it discusses the way in which this is not necessarily very well received by all consumers, because they do have a different expectation. So it's not necessarily a very bad example. So imagine that this is more expensive and the plastic wrapper is less expensive. Okay? With option A, the environmental friendly product, which costs 5, and option B, the traditional product, which costs 2. You are the consumer. You are still craving sugars here. You want to get as much chocolate as possible. Which one do you buy? Now, if you buy the more expensive product, are you acting rationally or irrationally? No. It depends on how we conceptualize the economic system and its value. Okay? If we understand rationality as the maximization in very utilitarian terms, as maximizing the utility that you are getting, if you buy this, you are acting irrationally. Okay? While the other one is acting rationally. Okay? Because they are actually getting more chocolate for a lower price. However, if we imagine a consumer that actually wants to contribute to the circular economy, to a more sustainable economy, and we conceptualize the economy in different terms for us, in more sustainable terms, the real question becomes, who is irrational here? Is it the consumer who is spending more because he wants to do a very little, in reality, unfortunately, contribution to achieve environmental protection, or is the one that in order to get just a little bit more of chocolate for a lower price is actually contributing to something which is deleterious for the environment? Now, my point here is that it depends. Okay? I'm not even saying that the one is more rational than the other, even if I have a preference, as you can imagine, for the answer. But the main point here is that this particular answer cannot be, this question cannot be answered without addressing a different question first, which does not have to do with how rational the average consumer is, or any other market participant. Well, I think I will stop here, and I thank you for your attention.